Welcome to the Building Performance Podcast, where we talk about tuning the physics, chemistry, and microbiology of homes. We used to call that high performance building, but it's just for everybody now because healthy is what we're really after. I'm very excited about today's conversation because we're talking about my favorite topic within this field, which is testing. We're going to talk with Paul Gannett, who is an expert in hobo data loggers at Onset. Paul, thank you very much for taking the time today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to get into the kind of psychology of testing first, because I have literally had clients myself who have their homes tested at the beginning. We find out exactly what's wrong, because that's the only way to find out what's wrong is by testing. And then we fix it. And then a year later, the client comes back and says, no, it feels bad in here again. And it's apparent to me, because I have access to the test tools, that I could go back and repeat the test and say, no, actually, it's not changed at all. What's changed is your expectations. Now your comfort levels are you're a little bit spoiled. I wouldn't say that to my clients, but you expect the home to be like this. So now when it gets a little bit colder, it feels as serious as it used to back when you were, living in a place that was so floppy. Have you found the same thing?
Comfort is a combination of the actual conditions and kind of the subjective perception. So that's where measurements comes in as an importance. Is that just my perception, or is it really different on those warmer days, that my basement's actually colder on warmer days, which seems counterintuitive? So that's where having the measurement data really kind of helps confirm some of your intuition. You can kind of combine the measurements with the perceptions, and you get a more complete picture of what's really happening.
And Paul, when we're using data loggers for whatever purpose, are there any best practices that we need to keep in mind? I know that there's a manual that comes in the box, but can you kind of give some tips?
One of the things I found in using data loggers is it helps to document the conditions when you're deploying the loggers. Things like the outside weather, you make notes of that. Was it a sunny day? Was it a hot day, cold day? Because that can affect how your HVAC systems are performing, and it can affect how you interpret the data. Because a lot of times when you get in and you see the data, you see something strange in it, and you say, well, what caused that? And if you've got some good documentation of your deployment conditions, that can help give you the insights to that. Another example is whether the rooms that you're monitoring, the doors were closed or open during that time. Can make a huge difference, like in the CO2 levels in that room, whether that door was closed or not. And actually, another handy tool for documenting the deployment of data loggers is pictures. Take pictures. If in doubt, take a picture of how you deployed it, because again, that can tell you something that might later shed some light in terms of what that data logger was seeing. Make sure to have a good filing system. It's a lot like keeping track of your pictures. You want to have a good filing system for your pictures so that when you go to look for that picture of grandma, whoever, that you can find it either by date, whatever. So set up a good file structure with folders for your data files so you can keep track of them, and you can find the data when you want to refer back to it.
You just shot me right in the heart and showed me what an amateur I am, because I've got I have no idea what's going on with my photos. I have kids who steal my phone and start taking pictures of whatever, but I'm going to take that to heart, and I'm going to work on my organization skills myself.
Yeah. I talk a better story than I practice. I always say, I wish I was doing it better.
Your work, I know, has mostly been outdoor atmospheric measurements, right? So I'm going to nerd out on homes because that's my particular thing. But your tools are very useful inside. I used this MX1102, which tracks temperature and humidity, and this number up here, which is carbon dioxide. When I traveled for these conferences, I went to the AHR Expo, I went to the IBS show, the Builder Show, and I also flew on planes. And I found that one of the expos was very well ventilated for the fact that they were having 10,000 people in this hall. If it was 1,000 parts per million, that was amazing. The other one spiked to 2,000 on the first day. But then I found out that the next day it was only 1,000. So it told me that something went wrong with their HVAC system. Meanwhile, on the plane, when you're boarding and you're already pissed off, you dropped your coffee or you left your bag, the stewardess is telling you that you need to do this or that. And you're like, but I wanna, and so everybody's upset. It was 3,500. So no wonder everybody's miserable. on the plane when they're getting on, because the air quality was terrible. It wasn't just that it was a very stressful environment. It was also that there were other things going on. And I think that's what people miss. How does the sampling work? Because I noticed that there's a statistics sampling and then just a straight up sample. Can you kind of describe those features?
Yeah, but part of the secret sauce of making data loggers that can operate off of battery power for an extended time is that most of the time the data logger's off. If you're sampling at a 1 minute interval, it's basically asleep for most of that minute. And then it just turns on very quickly, takes its measurement, does what it needs to do, stores that memory, then goes back to sleep. The other thing is these loggers do have displays, and you say, well, geez, it's running the display all the time. LCD displays are extremely efficient when they're just in that steady state. So that allows these loggers, that combination of the sleep time and the low power components, allows them to run for several months off of just a couple of AA batteries, which is part of the convenience of them. Is you don't have to plug them into the wall; you just take them wherever, and you can deploy them.
And so the difference between the sampling and the statistics sampling, can you describe that?
With the statistics sampling, that's basically fast logging. You're taking samples at a faster rate, so it does have to wake up more frequently, and then it's just storing either an average of the readings over that time, the minimum and maximum values over that time. So it's not storing the actual readings in the statistics world. It's not storing the reading it gets. It's just adding it to a pile and then doing something with that pile. Exactly. And a lot of times that reduces the amount of data, which is good in some ways, because sometimes you can get overwhelmed with data, but you just want to know, how hot did it get? How cool did it get? Or what's the average? And also the average is a nice way of eliminating noise in the systems. Sometimes if there's lights or motors in the room, that can throw off the measurements slightly, because they are electrical measurements fundamentally. So electrical interference can interfere with those measurements. And if you have averaging, it'll average out those little subtle variations in the noise and give you a more accurate measurement.
So in an outside environment, what do people use these for to track, and what are they able to do with that data in your experience?
We sell a lot into environmental research applications. And in those cases, they're trying to understand what's happening out there that's affecting the ecosystems in there. It can be outdoor or water ecosystems that they're monitoring. For example, snowpack is real important out west for the water supply. Forests are important to that, but forests are also important for the lumber industry. So we need the lumber to build houses, but at the same time, those trees are creating an ecosystem that keeps the snowpack up there, which is important for our water. The same thing can apply to wildlife. It can apply to water ecology as well.
So you've got Bluetooth data loggers, and then you've got these that can hook up to like an actual probe. You just put a probe into it. I've got one right here that's got a 6-foot extension on it that can measure temperature and humidity. I've got ones that have a little stake, like a cooking thermometer, which I want to know what you guys use that for specifically. But essentially, what I was thinking you could do with this is embed this into a wall that you've built. And I know that at that point you lose it. This only costs, we're talking about less than $150, right? For most of these.
Yeah, that price range, yep.
And so if you wanted to be sure that you were controlling the temperature, relative humidity, vapor flow through, the nerd level on a lot of the high-end builder stuff that's out there is very intimidating, nerd level. Mm-hmm. And by the way, these are called pendant sensors, which are, I think, explicitly meant to be lost forever eventually, right?
They're very low cost, so they can be. Usually, our users find a way to recover their data loggers. For example, if they want to monitor temperature and humidity in a wall, what they'll typically do is we have models with an external TempRH probe, and then they can drill a small hole and put that into the wall and monitor the conditions that way. We do have some users that use thermocouple loggers to monitor concrete curing. And those are kind of cut off, because the temperature sensor gets embedded in the concrete. When it cures, you're not getting it out of there. You just cut off the thermocouple wire. Thermocouple wire is basically just wire. It's pretty low cost. It's two different metals which act as a battery, and the temperature output of the thermocouple wire is proportional to the temperature. It's just a battery that's temperature dependent.
Oh, so you'd only lose the wire in that.
You
scenario,
only lose
not-
yeah, exactly. Yep.
This is this called thermal grease? How does this work?
Yeah, that thermal grease is important for measuring any sort of surface temperature, because anytime you have a juncture of two materials, there's a time lag, and then you clamp it down. If you're monitoring a pipe, you use a hose clamp to clamp it down tightly. If you're putting it on a wall, best to just screw it onto the wall. And then, as you say, use the insulation over that sensor to isolate that area from room temperature. So that combination of things is important for getting good surface or pipe temperature measurements.
And do all of your data loggers do second to second measurements? Do any of them go less than a second, or do any of them, lag like 30 seconds is the smallest period that you can take?
Yeah, typically the fastest logging rate for our loggers is 1 second. We do have some specialty loggers which monitor tilt and acceleration that can log faster than a second. So, certainly that technology exists out there. And we do, on the other side, have some very power hungry data loggers that we recommend. Like even the CO2 logger, that uses a fair amount of energy for that CO2 sensor. So we recommend for most deployments that you limit that to a 5-minute logging rate. You can go faster if you want.
The 1104 has one port in it where I can use a probe that I attach of my choosing.
Mhm.
And then it also monitors temperature, relative humidity, and light. And what I'm going to build out of this later, which I'm going to post in a separate video. So please, if I remember to, I will post the link right now on the screen. But I'm going to make what's called a mean radiant temperature thermometer, which basically does the same thing as our body does, where the air temperature could be 70. Your thermostat could say, oh, it's 70 in here. That's fine. But really, it's much hotter than that because all the surfaces in the room are very hot and they're radiating in, which the thermostat is not necessarily picking up on. So I'm going to make one of those with this. But the light sensor, what do people normally, is that for like daylight sensing when the sun comes up and down normally? Or what are people using this for when they're not using it for what I'm doing with it?
There's a few ways that light sensor is used. One way is in museums where they're very concerned with light levels as they might affect what's being stored there. So it gives you a good indication of how much light is coming into the space, how much time the lights are on, and the effects of sunlight. That'll give you a good picture of that. The another way that light sensor is really useful is it's a proxy for occupancy for a room. If the lights are on, and especially if the logger is deployed near a light, you can see when the room's occupied and not occupied. Now, it won't necessarily tell you if the lights are on and nobody's home, but it gives you a pretty good indication of occupancy. And that, of course, factors into things like your temperature and RH measurements, the other measurements that you can measure on that logger. You can start to correlate and paint a more complete picture of what's been happening. And
interesting. I wonder if I could use this as a way to reverse engineer a calculation for how much cooling there needs to be in a room. How sensitive? I know that the temperature and relative humidity sensitivity is great, and that the accuracy of those. Actually, if you could kind of like share exactly what the accuracy is on temperature and relative humidity, but also what units we're measuring light in and how much sensitivity there is. Like, could I put this in direct sunlight and have it not blow up?
It's a good question. It is intended more for indoor light measurements. So the range in full sun, I think if it's inside and it's in full sun, it will measure that accurately. If you're trying to do any sort of accurate light measurements, you want to be careful about that orientation. If you point it directly at the light source, obviously it's going to be more sensitive than if you have it at an angle relative to the light source. So that is one way. If you're inside and you don't want to overrange the sensor, you can put it at a, typically light sensors are deployed at a horizontal orientation, and then you make adjustments for the angle.
On a wall, you mean, or on the flat like this?
On the flat.
Oh, interesting.
More typical, especially outdoors, because outdoors there's mathematical formulas that tell you that on this day at this time the sun was at this angle, and you can correlate that with the with the data in there to say determine exactly how brightly the sun was shining that day. Even though the sun might be lower in the sky, it could still be shining brightly. You can use those mathematical formulas to determine that.
In a house, it might be easy because if the ceiling is white and I was to point this at the ceiling, then it could tell me how much sunlight is coming into the room. So as far as the accuracy of the temperature and relative humidity, what is the accuracy like as an average across all the sensors? MX1101, 02, 04, are they different, or is it all the same sensor that you're putting on all these data loggers?
Yeah, most of our loggers we use thermistor sensors in, and our standard for temperature accuracy is 0.2 degrees Celsius, which is about slightly less than half a degrees Fahrenheit, and their resolution is about even an order of magnitude finer than that, so you can actually see some subtle changes sometimes. And the RH is typically 2% over your normal household ranges. I think we spec it for 3%, but typically it's going to be in the 2% range. Light sensors are not quite as accurate, and those are typically measured in lumens. And if you're 5% accurate with a light sensor, you're doing pretty good. Just some variability in those, unless you go obviously to a high end light sensor. But the ones we use in our loggers are more in the 5% range.
Sure. As a supplemental, kind of like an extra piece of information to add to the other invisible dynamics. Let me ask you this about calibration, because I had an interesting thing when we were shooting our TV show, our final episode in this house, which is very airtight. And I have a ventilation system that is designed for a family of 5 and 2 cats, and not for 10 people on a film crew to be in here, breathing hard and all this stuff. I had this set up, and it spiked up to like 2000. We're trying to like make it an intelligent TV show. And I was definitely, my brain was not working as well as it could have been. But then after that, this went off. And you and I, when we talked at AHR, you said that humidity spikes can make the CO2 reading change. Can you kind of go into how that works and what we should be careful of when we're using, is it just CO2 that's going to be affected by that, or any of the other sensors as well?
It really takes a high humidity for it to affect the CO2 readings. I think you need to be above 80% humidity before it really has a significant effect on the CO2 readings. There may be a factor in there too if there's a rapid change in humidity. I'm not sure about that, but sometimes a changing environment, certainly a changing temperature environment, can affect the accuracy of your RH measurements as well if there's rapid changes. So the electronics likes it to be a little more stable to get the best accuracy. So the response time is an important spec to look at in some of these measurements.
I made the mistake of turning this on, and I did not manually calibrate it for the CO2. I literally activated it and pressed start logging right as my film crew arrived. And apparently, can you describe what this does to auto calibrate itself for CO2? Because it was like way off. It was telling me that the level of CO2 in my house later was like 300. And I think it's because it took a sample and then it told itself like, oh, this is what we want. So what I've learned now is that I need to manually calibrate it outside for 10 minutes. And I set the app to manually calibrate, and then I let it breathe outside air, and it calls that 400. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah. It averages those readings to get the most accurate measurement of what the CO2 is outside. So those outdoor readings now become 400. So it does any scaling factor that needs to do, multiplying up or multiplying down. And then all readings after that use that same calibration factor to make them more accurate. And it works surprisingly well.
When it auto calibrates, what happens there?
Yeah, that happens. I think it's on like an 8-day schedule, something on that order of magnitude. And it's taking the lowest readings in a space, which is typically in the middle of the night when nobody's in a space, and assumes that those readings are at 400 as well, that lowest level, that you've had decent exchange. So if you've got a tightly sealed house, you may never reach those super low 400 level readings. So it's going to, throw your scaling off.
It seems like also this is when you're taking something that's a commercial and industrial tool and trying to apply it to houses, like nobody's in an office building in the middle of the night. But the middle of the night is definitely when everybody is at home, right? So like that might be an interesting thing where I think that the message there is that if you're using these in a home, manually calibrate for the CO2 at least. You don't manually calibrate like your MX1101s just for temperature and relative humidity, right?
Yeah. Temperature sensors and relative humidity sensors are well characterized, and you don't have to calibrate those.
Great. Does this sensor, because I can manually calibrate it, does it mean the sensor will last a lot longer even when it gets old and creaky? I could still let it sample outside and be like, okay, whatever it is you think that is, I want you to call that 400. Does that kind of extend the life of the sensor?
Yeah, it does help. I can't speak specifically to the life on that sensor. And at some point, the calibration becomes so far off that it's not able to calibrate that out. But yeah, that should give you many, that calibration allows those sensors to be used for several years.
Let me ask you this. With Hobo Connect, the app, is there any way to get absolute humidity numbers like grains per pound to be extrapolated? I know that I can do that on my own, but I'd love to have it be in the graph.
Yeah, that's not a feature we've included in Hobo Connect at this point. We actually, in some of our previous software packages, we had something called HoboWare, and that did include a calculation for grains per pound. So it's just math. We just haven't incorporated that into Hobo Connect. But yeah, that is a very handy way of looking at data, because you can tell what the real humidity is, how much moisture is in the air. So that is an important way to look at the data.
Well, can I just give a feature request?
Yeah. Okay.
Just like put it on the list. Consider it, because I would love that, and that would be very useful for our clients for sure. Awesome. Well, I look forward to coming up with all kinds of off-label uses for your data loggers. There will be more videos in the series, and we're going to kind of get creative with how we use them on things like my Death Star HVAC training tool behind me. Paul, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the chance to talk through this. It's been great.
Paul Gannett is an expert on Hobo data loggers at Onset. You have been listening to the Building Performance Podcast. I'm Corbett Lunsford. Tune in next time.